So welcome everyone. Rabbi Serrata, we're talking about The Front with Woody Allen. And let me just say, this week, Mia Farrow's documentary on HBO came out talking about Woody Allen. Rabbi, I don't know if you saw it, but
I have not seen it. And to be honest, with all the scuttlebutt about Woody Allen, I was a little apprehensive about putting a movie on, and chose this one in part because he's just an actor in this movie. He did not write or direct this movie. It's one of the rare movies that he appears in only as an actor. So there's two or three others. I mean, the first Casino Royale back in 1967, a movie called I think it's called L.A. Story, maybe, or Beverly Hills Story, something like that. About 11 years after this one, but this actually, I do think this movie is somewhat pivotal in Woody Allen's career in some ways. Even though he did not write or direct this movie, the next year he directed and wrote Annie Hall. So this came out in between the Woody Allen movies Love and Death and Annie Hall. And much as I love the early comedies of Woody Allen, there's a clear change in direction from 1974 to 1977, right? So from a very big difference between Love and Death and Annie Hall, I'd say. And so some of it is attributed to the screenwriter of this movie, who, and director Woody Allen spent some time observing them and seeing how you can make a movie that has comedy in it, but is also a very serious story. And so that's, this movie pretty successfully, I would say, goes back and forth between comedy and tragedy. It's there's for an example, just look at the character that Zero Mostel plays in the movie. So it's the first introduction of Zero Mostel to the writer played by Woody Allen, and gives him a big hug. Where have you been? This stuff. And say, you know each other already? He said, never seen him before in my life. Right? It's classic Zero Mostel. By the way, Zero Mostel, going all the way back to 1943, he appears in Life magazine in 1943. Life magazine called him the funniest man in America in 1943. So long before he was a big star on Broadway, I mean, just his comedic performances in nightclubs and other places made him the funniest man in America. So
I read some, Rabbi, I read somewhere that here's some pictures of Zero Mostel, that this was like Woody Allen's first serious movie.
Yeah, in a sense, it's his first serious role, that's for sure. And you sort of debate on what other roles he has. Even in his serious movies, sometimes he's the comic relief in those movies. So and I guess this is serious, but of course it has some very Woody Allen-esque lines that were written for him by the screenwriter Walter Bernstein. For instance, in his talking with the associate producer, the girlfriend part, she says she comes from Connecticut, and the biggest sin in her family was to raise your voice. And he says, the biggest sin in my family is to pay retail, right? So that's a very Woody Allen-esque line. And so you can ask yourself whether this is a serious role. I mean, it is, but it's also not, right? It as I would suggest, it opens a vein for him that you can be comic and serious at the same time, right? So Um, if you didn't know going into the movie, the credits at the end tell you what you really need to know about this movie, that most of the main creative forces in this movie are people who were blacklisted in the 1950s blacklist. And way back when we first started talking about movies, 16 weeks ago with Gentleman's Agreement and some of the folks involved with that, it seemed like week after week I was telling you, and this one was blacklisted and that one was blacklisted. And indeed, these are some examples of the folks who were. So Martin Ritt, who directed this movie, was blacklisted. You've undoubtedly seen movies by him. He's not generally thought of as being sort of an auteur so we don't think of him in the same breath that we think of some of the great directors of the 20th century. But chances are you've seen at least a few of his movies. Just give you a few: The Long Hot Summer from 1958, HUD with Paul Newman, 1963, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold with Richard Burton, The Great White Hope with James Earl Jones in 1970, Cicely Tyson, who just passed away a month or so ago, in Sounder, 1972, Norma Ray with Sally Field, 1974, I think. Barbara Streisand in Nuts in 1987, right? These are all Martin Ritt movies. He got his start in live TV, something like Sidney Lumet. I mean, back in the 1950s, directing the live television. So we get to see kind of a glimpse of what that might have looked like in this movie, right? So writing from his experience, Walter Bernstein writing from his experience, Martin Ritt directing from his experience, what it might look like on set in a way to create those live television shows each week. And if you think about the daunting task of doing that, right, of putting on a live show week after week, right, it's really quite remarkable, and so they ate up scripts, right? Every week you needed another 30-minute, 60-minute, 90-minute script to go live with, right? So not all of them were classics, that's for sure. Some of them were. I mean, Marty, which was the best picture, I think, of 1956 at the Oscars, was first a live TV drama. I forget who played it on TV. I mean, it was Ernest Borgnine in the movies, but someone else played it on TV first, right? So I mean, this is sort of an unheard of thing, right? A television play from 1954 released in 1955 as a movie and wins the Best Picture Oscar in 1956. Right? So, so those live. That's how Martin Ritt got his start. Then was blacklisted in the 50s, and then was able to sort of make his way back into movies by the late 50s, early 60s. There is no evidence that he was ever a communist. He was certainly a liberal, perhaps I think called himself a leftist, but never a member of the Communist Party. His movies, including this one, of course, show concerns about classism, about progressive issues, racism, labor movements. He actually makes a movie, his first movie really, after being blacklisted, is in 1957. He's on the blacklist from 1951 till 1957. He makes a movie called Edge of the City, and it's actually it's sort of like the mirror image of On the Waterfront. On the Waterfront is about corrupt unions, right? Edge of the City is about how the unions save the lives of workers, right? So you can see that's where the sensibilities, from 1957 to Norma Ray, in 76, something like that,
So Rod Steiger played Marty on television.
Rod Steiger played. I thought so, but I didn't want to say it. It sounded too obvious, right? To me.
Internet confirmed.
Yeah. So yeah. So his movie Edge of the City is the mirror image of On the Waterfront, right? And throughout his career, I mean, he certainly talked about the value of shielding others from evil. I mean, I think there's some interesting conversation in this movie, you know, with in the dairy bar where they're eating, you know, there's a lot of discussion about making sure that Woody Allen's character Howard Prince knows exactly what he's getting into, and when he's going to be called before this subdivision of the HUAC committee, you know, what he can, you know, they want to protect him as an innocent. He wants to protect them both as a source of income and for other reasons. So Martin Ritt, if maybe it doesn't go without saying, he's Jewish, born to a Jewish family in New York City. He went to DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, and then started out his college career at a college called Elon College in North Carolina. The racism that he saw in going from the Bronx to, you know, it transformed his life, right? Going to Elon College and seeing the kind of institutionalized racism of the South in those days. And really, it's probably one of the reasons that he was attracted to movies like Sounder and The Great White Hope, actually, which certainly talk about racism. The writer of this movie, who was nominated for Best Screenplay, is a guy named Walter Bernstein. Walter Bernstein was also blacklisted. Of course, you saw this all in the credits. He was blacklisted in the 1950s for 8 years. He actually just died last month, believe it or not. He was 102 years old. But 1919 to 2021, just passed away. So pretty remarkable. He was born in Brooklyn and went to Dartmouth College, where he was actually a part of the Young Communist League at Dartmouth. So he was indeed a card-carrying member, I guess we could say, of the American Communist Party, which, remember, was not necessarily, right? I mean, they were democratic communists, right? They believed in communist ideals, but achieved through elections, right? So that was the intention. So he moved to 1947 to Hollywood, and one of his first jobs in Hollywood was working for a director by the name of Robert Rawson, who is the director of Body and Soul, which we're going to watch next week. So his sort of formative Hollywood experience was in working on this movie that we'll watch for next time. So you can perhaps draw some inferences and connections. You'll see some interesting things, I think, when we look at the two. He said that and in fact, after he was blacklisted in the early 1950s, he did in fact use a number of fronts. So we don't really know how many screenplays Walter Bernstein wrote, right? The same is true of the writer of Body and Soul for next week. And Bernstein actually said that the characters that he created for this movie are not based on any particular individual, not based entirely on his own life, but a kind of a combination of different writers that he knew, including, he mentioned specifically himself, Arnold Manoff, and Abe Polonsky. Abe Polonsky is actually the writer of Body and Soul. Was also, once he was able to get past the blacklist, Abe Polonsky actually became a movie director as well, and directed a couple of very good films. We'll talk about him more next week. but like Bernstein, we also actually have no idea how many screenplays these guys actually wrote because of the various fronts and false names that they used. I see in the chat someone asked about Dalton Trumbo. I don't think Dalton Trumbo was Jewish, so he falls slightly outside the scope of our class, but he certainly is is another example of a great writer who was blacklisted, and is also credited as being the writer who, in a sense, broke the blacklist. I mean, there's no question that Dalton Trumbo, under assumed names, was nominated and probably won Oscars for screenplays during the 1950s. So, yeah, I see there's actually Abraham Polanski. There's a small picture for one of his movies, Force of Evil, one of the great film noirs. Actually, it was directed by Abe Polanski. So again, falls outside the scope of our particular class, but definitely worth seeing. We'll talk about, as I said, we'll talk about Abe Polanski next week more. Dalton Trumbo, you may remember, wrote the screenplay. He's credited in the movie Exodus, right, for writing the screenplay for Exodus. And then that same year wrote the screenplay for Spartacus. And those two movies are credited in many ways with breaking the blacklist, allowing these blacklisted writers and directors to start working under their own name again. Martin Ritt, the director of this movie, spent his time on the blacklist in New York City teaching acting at the Actors Studio, right? This is the very famous the studio method. So he was one of the teachers. He did some acting himself, but he taught and he directed. So he was able to work New York being bucking some of the trend in the rest of the country, and certainly the timidity of Hollywood. And so blacklisted writers, directors, actors were able to get some work in New York, probably not Broadway, but off Broadway, doing various kinds of things, some of it paid, some of it not, but getting through that time. So of course, Bernstein and Ritt, as I mentioned, were both Jews, both New Yorkers, both blacklisted, right? We also know that some of the actors and in this movie were subject to the blacklist as well. So that comes up at the end as well. Zero Mostel dealt with the blacklist during the 1950s. So the character he's playing is drawn in part from his own life. He was called to testify famously before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and equally, he was the funniest man in America. He made a farce out of the interrogation, right? So it actually makes for some pretty entertaining reading to read Zero Mostel's testimony in front of the committee. So he jousted with them and essentially said, what did you think I was doing, selling acting secrets to the Russians? And so making a point of saying how little he knew, much like the character in this movie, it was just about this girl, he was on a blacklist, but he managed ultimately, of course, to get past that. Herschel Bernardi is in this movie, and of course you may recognize him from some of his other roles. He had a recurring role on Peter Gunn on television, and he had his own TV series for a few years called Arnie, which you may remember. I remember it fondly. He also did a lot of voiceover work. He appeared on Broadway in a revival of Fiddler on the Roof in 1981. So in this movie, you've got not one Tevye, but two in the front. He got his start, though, actually as a child actor in Yiddish language movies. So So Herschel Bernardi, and that, by the way, I believe is his real name. I don't think he changed his name. I believe it was the original Zorba on Broadway and Zorba the Greek, before Anthony Quinn played that role in the movies. But he got his start in the 1930s in uh, Yiddish language movies as a child. I mean, he's in the movie Green Fields, which is considered to be one of the great Yiddish movies. He's also in one called The Singing Blacksmith as a child, which is a very good Moshe Oisher Yiddish movie. Uh, for real trivia buffs, he was also the voice of Charlie the Tuna in the Starkist Tuna ads, if you remember that. So so quite a varied career, and again managed to survive the blacklist and go on to great work. So mention a couple of other folks who are in this movie. They're also mentioned at the end as being blacklisted. A guy named Josh Shelley. His um, real name is Kurzweil. He plays the owner of the Catskills Resort in this movie, but he was blacklisted. Lloyd Gow is mentioned. He was on the blacklist from 1952 to 64. He was a pretty well-known character actor, and he plays the one of the writers in this movie, the one with the Irish last name. I can't think of the name at the moment. Probably in my notes here somewhere. But Lloyd Gow, I mean, it's interesting. He was blacklisted in 1952. He was the main bad guy in a movie that came out that year, Rancho Notorious, which is a pretty good movie. But if you look at the credits, you won't see his name because he was blacklisted. They released the movie. They took his name off the credits. So, but again, we'll talk about him a little bit next week because he plays a character in Body and Soul as well. So in 1947, he was, rising up as a character actor. 1952, he's blacklisted. He doesn't appear in anything again until TV appearances starting in 1964. A couple of the younger people who appear in this movie, and we'll put Woody Allen in that category, of course, playing Howard Prince. He was born in 1935, was the youngest writer on Your Show of Shows, started out just bringing coffee to people like Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner and Neil Simon, all of whom were writers on that show of shows. Was never blacklisted, although he may be canceled, which is a different category, I think. But he, was born Alan Stort Konigsberg in New York, and changed his name to Woody Allen. So, of course, of Jewish descent. The other folks we'll mention in the cast, I mean, Michael Murphy, who plays his childhood school friend who first approaches him to be a front for him. You may recognize his face. I mean, he's been in a couple of Woody Allen movies, actually. I mean, Manhattan in particular. But he was also someone who was very well liked by Robert Altman. Appears in a lot of Robert Altman movies, including MASH and Nashville. He was also in An Unmarried Woman, which I think came up a couple of weeks ago in our discussions. And the actress who plays Florence, perhaps not as familiar a face to you. Her name's Andrea Marcovici. She actually performed. I actually saw her sing live in New York City. She played in the Oak Room at the Algonquin, the cabaret show for 25 years or more. So she's well known in New York circles as a cabaret singer. This was her first movie as an actress. She's appeared in small parts in a lot of things, even to the present day. And I think she also got her start acting in The Young and the Restless, a TV soap opera for a couple of years. So, but she's continued to appear in things over the years in small parts. So let's move to the movie itself and how it works kind of structurally and some of the different things in it. And then of course, open it up for some discussion and things. Um, so the movie begins, uh, it, you can't, I wouldn't exactly call it a credit sequence. It starts in silence. The credits actually play white letters on a black screen with no music whatsoever. When the images start after the credits are actually over, then you hear the song Young at Heart by Frank Sinatra, which I this is only, you know, sort of just weird trivia, I suppose. But of course, Frank Sinatra was Mia Farrow's husband before Woody Allen. So just sort of a strange piece of trivia there. But the song Young at Heart, and in the background, what we see are a series of film clips, and I think some are still, some are moving, of you know, sort of setting the stage for the times that we're talking about. I'm not sure I caught everything here, but it starts with Senator Joe McCarthy's wedding, right? So there's images of Senator McCarthy in the wedding. That's the very first thing as Young at Heart is playing. But then you get some war footage, which I believe is World War II bombers. That you have something that looks a little more like um, you know, you have a ticker tape parade, which maybe is the end of the war. You have General Douglas MacArthur in the ticker tape parade. You've got people going into bombshells. You've got Harry Truman going to a baseball game. You have, I think it's maybe Truman's inauguration. There's some images of Lily Pons, George Murphy, Marilyn Monroe, Joe DiMaggio, Rocky Marciano, the Korean War. We see some bathing beauties. We see Dwight Eisenhower. We see Mrs. America, 1952. I didn't look her up to see who was Mrs. America. Yeah, and Nancy Franks has reminded her of newsreels, and I think it probably actually is newsreel footage. I wouldn't be surprised. But yeah, I mean, it's exactly that, trying to show us the situation. We see soldiers coming home. We see the Rosenbergs. We see the Rosenbergs at their arrest. We see protests about the Rosenbergs. You know, so the movie kind of in the space of a minute or two sort of sets its place and time as say, you know, what would we say about it? You know, it's sort of clean cut and hopeful and all American on the one hand, but there's a dark side to it, right? That's being portrayed as well. And that all dissolves into the deli where Woody Allen works, where he's sitting at the cash register, and Michael Murphy comes in. And, you know, you get to know a bit about Woody Allen's character just in that opening moment. You know, so he's making book on a boxing match. Which, by the way, I believe I read that if that bet would have won him $500 actually. So, so that the real boxers, a real match that took place in 1953. So, so that puts us in the time period, right? You may have caught Danny Aiello, a well-known character actor in a small part as the grocer, who Woody Allen owes some money to for some of his past bets that have been paid off. We see Howard, that's Woody Allen's character, of course, Howard Prince, hitting up his brother who's in the fur trade for cash, right? And so he really needs this money. And uh, so, and doesn't really know anything from communism, doesn't really know anything from the blacklist, is happy to help, right? And happy to help for the 10% commission that he's going to get, which I'd say starts out somewhat altruistically, saying, yeah, I'll just do it for you. You're a friend. And they said, well, I can't, then it's 10%. And then of course the 10% becomes incredibly important to him. And you see in short order, this is part of the comedy of it. I could handle 2 or 3 more writers, you must have some other friends, right? And so pretty soon he's got a whole stable of writers, and quickly goes from being just the front to handing some of them back their work and saying, this isn't up to my standards, right? And this needs to be rewritten. And then of course in one of the other scenes in the film, when the discover that the Holocaust plot has to be rewritten that day so that they can film it that night, because the gas company that's sponsor thinks that it makes gas look bad. So they have to rewrite the Holocaust scenes, and Michael Murphy has to show up in a cab downstairs with the rewritten pages. So you get the sense of the movie, right? So what makes this movie Jewish, I guess, would be my question, and throw that out. Maybe someone would like to answer. Let's not make that a rhetorical question. What do you think? Does this belong in a real Jewish Hall of Fame? What makes this movie Jewish? Brenda?
Aren't a lot of Jews involved in liberal causes?
Well, there's no question that that's true. So that's a part of it. I mean, Jews were certainly highly affected by this blacklist. By the way, not always because they were communists or liberals. They were just suspect because they were Jews, right? The State Department was infamously anti-Semitic, in World War II and before that, despite the fact that Roy Cohn and people like that were involved with Joe McCarthy, I mean, he certainly had nothing nice to say about Jews either. So when we talked about some of the folks who made a gentleman's agreement were suspect just because they made a movie about anti-Semitism. Forget about their communist leanings, whether they had them or didn't. So it certainly does. What else? What else did you see? Did you catch anything that's particularly Jewish or explicitly Jewish in this movie? Does anyone want to unmute and say something?
Well,
Brenda, go ahead.
I don't quite know how to express this, but the role that Woody Allen played, where he was very interested in making money off of other people, isn't this also a Jewish stereotype, if nothing else? I'm not saying that's the way
Right.
it should be, but that's how Jews are sometimes thought.
Yeah. So I think, sure. I mean, that's part of it too, right? I mean, he plays as we're saying, unlike the movie we watched a couple of weeks ago, which has a rabbi in it and, Holocaust survivors, right? I mean, it's kind of explicitly Jewish, right? This movie, it's more often than not, is, we might say, implicitly Jewish. I mean, the fact that when they get together, they go to a kosher restaurant, right? They go to a dairy bar, right? No explanation given about why they go to this particular place, and it's New York City. Maybe it's just because it's convenient, but it's like a restaurant like that doesn't really exist in other places where they go and the food that the waiter brings. I mean, they hardly any attention is paid to it, but he keeps bringing a vegetable cutlet and things that you only get in a kosher dairy bar.
And a chocolate phosphate too.
Right. Yeah. So stuff like that. Right. Not just the Woody Allen character, but the other characters are engaging in Jewish behaviors of various kinds. The brother who's in the fur trade, right? I mean, he's in the garment business, right? That's a it wasn't that only Jews were in the garment business, but in New York City, if you had a brother in the fur trade, I mean, that not so unlikely, right? Among Jews. Yeah.
Yeah.
Alice?
Yeah, I was going to say, to me, it seemed very New Yorkish. And I know there are a lot of Jews in New York, obviously, and we're in the 50s, but I think a lot of the things that stuck out to me were more just things that I think typified, New York in the 1950s, maybe rather than Jewish, but maybe there's a big overlap, obviously.
Right. A big overlap and hard to tell the difference sometimes, right? And what's Jewish and what's New York, right? A visit to the Catskills, right? He and Hecky Brown go out to the Catskills where, again, you get some of the humor, Woody Allen meets an attractive young lady at the front desk and she asks what he does for a living and, he's a writer and she just turns her back and walks away. Hey, at the bar, when he introduces himself as a dentist, much more attractive. My father was a dentist, so I relate to that line.
Were the Catskills only Jewish?
They weren't only Jewish, but I mean, when we talk about that scene, I mean, Hecky Brown going up there to perform. I mean, it's so much like Grossinger's, which is right. I mean, there were. It's sort of like if you weren't Jewish, you went to the Berkshires, right? If you were Jewish, you couldn't go to the Berkshires. You had to go to the Catskills. Right now, some of that is our own sort of self-enforcement, right? And we want to go where people are that we like. They're funny. They have the same sense of humor we do. They have the same entertainers that we like. But we're also not welcome at certain country clubs, right, and certain places. And so, if you wanted to, in a certain time period, in this time period, in the early 19th,
I spent a summer up there, and I never even realized it.
Yeah. If you wanted to play golf, the clubs that would accept you were in the Catskills and not the Berkshires, right? Nowadays, of course, anybody can go to the Berkshires, and people do, and plenty of Jews do, and times have changed dramatically. But going back to that time, and I would say that in some ways that those scenes in the Catskills, even the crowds and the food and everything, sort of quintessentially Jewish Catskills, even though nobody says anything explicitly Jewish there.
But there were other resorts there that were not Jewish?
Yeah, but I suppose so. I only know the Jewish ones.
Okay.
Were. There's we showed a documentary a few years ago about one of the last Jewish resorts up there, a place called Kutcher's. Welcome to Kutcher's is the documentary if you want to know more about sort of that time period. And and they lasted certainly at least into the 80s and 90s. I mean, a place like
Mrs. Maisel's place is for sale.
Yeah. So there's a lot of those kinds of things in this movie, which I think New York, Jewish, I mean, it sort of percolates underneath. The most explicit thing I can think of in the movie is there's a scene where Hecky Brown comes to visit Woody Allen's character in his apartment, and he gives him a drink, and he tips back the drink and he says, "I never learned how to sip a drink." And he tells it, and he says, "It's my father would come home and he'd mumble a few words, and Zero Mistel mumbles a few Hebrew sounding words and has the drink, right? So we don't actually hear the words, but he's basically saying, my father would come home, he'd make a bracha, and he'd drink his drink, right? So this also doesn't ring a bell for me as much as it does for my wife. I mean, her father did that pretty much every night after work too. Came home, poured himself a drink, said a bracha, and swallowed it, and then went on with his evening. So, yeah, Maxine.
Same thing in my house. My father would have a martini. I mean, and he never sipped a martini. It just went all the way down. I don't know if he said any prayer, but he just downed a martini. And my parents were not, I would tell you, they really weren't drinkers. That's the only time they basically, he'd drink.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And the other thing, when Woody Allen said, I never buy anything retail, it was a sin to buy something retail. I mean,
Right.
that's a very Jewish prejudice.
Yeah, it's a Jewish joke, let's say. Whether it's it's the kind of joke that Jews can tell Jews, and we get offended if somebody not Jewish says it about us.
Exactly.
Right? But it's at least it used to be perfectly acceptable for Jews to talk to Jews that way, right?
Well, Black people call each other nigger, nigger this, nigger that. But if you called them that, it would be a terrible thing.
Right. And so I think that this is true in kind of all ethnic groups, that there's some elements of humor and things like that that you can and that you can say to each other that you can't say, that other people can't say to you. So and that's reasonable to me. And this movie, I think, has quite a lot of that, right? So it's a movie. I would say that this is a Jewish movie. That's why I put it in the class. Although unlike most of the other films, I don't think the word Jew or Jewish is mentioned in this movie at any point, right? We certainly heard it plenty in The Pawnbroker last week. We heard it in going all the way back to the very first class when we were talking about Gentleman's Agreement. We talked about how the word Jewish hadn't really appeared in movies up until then. But so this is something somewhat different, and where it's a movie with Jewish characters in it. It's not specifically about Judaism, but it's still a Jewish movie. So I think someone had a hand up. I lost it. Did someone have a hand up?
Nancy, go ahead.
I was gonna say, when I've been sort of mulling on what made this Jewish, a Jewish film, and I think it was the sensibilities, the humor, the even the serious parts of it. It was very New York. I grew up in Chicago, but I think that is more, it's the sensibilities and the sense of humor, and especially like the gas company. I mean, maybe, Woody Allen's been around for so long, maybe his humor has become Jewish humor and vice versa, but it was that kind of very sarcastic, dry, over my shoulder, wicked thing to say that is kind of like, kinohara,
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Books have been written about Jewish humor, where it comes from, how it's developed. I mean, and how much of it has become just a part of American humor, right? So it's quite remarkable. Here it is, the week of Purim. I mean, this is Purim has this long tradition of being iconoclastic, and this is not a reform or conservative or Orthodox thing, right? Orthodox Jews on Purim do things they wouldn't do the rest of the year, right? That's, when I was living in Israel in 1983, seeing the young yeshiva bucher, teenagers, the unmarried men dressing as women on Purim, right? With makeup And, I mean, really go all out, and it's so iconoclastic in their community to do that. But that's what Purim's about. It's, nothing is sacred. And that spills out, I think, into Jewish humor overall, right? That it's okay to joke about the government, right? Even in tough places and tough times, right? I seem to remember there was a whole book of Russian Jewish humor published in the 1970s, actually. Jewish anti-Soviet humor, right, during the time of the refuseniks and stuff. I don't remember it being that funny to me at the time, but I mean, they were okay. It was an okay joke book. Think of a comedian like Yakov Smirnoff, who came from the Soviet Union, and his whole act was built on making fun of the Soviet Union. Now, admittedly, that went over better in America than it did there. Came here and I remember him talking about coming to America and buying his first piece of furniture, and the store had a guarantee: we stand behind our furniture for 6 months. And he said, that's why I left Russia, right? So we do have this history of being, there's no sacred cows, if you like, in Jewish tradition, and that's particularly true, going way back. I mean, you might even say that the Purim story itself is kind of a Jewish joke, right? I was talking about this briefly on Sunday, but when people were marching in Charlottesville a few years ago, I mean, their big slogan was "Jews will not replace us." The story of Purim is about Jews replacing people, right? Queen Esther replaces the queen. Mordecai replaces Haman. It's exactly that, right? It's and of course it's not something that really happens in Jewish history. So it's a kind of a parody. What could, what the world could be if Jews ran the world, right? So it's definitely the humor is a part of it. But I'd also say the movie's social conscience is a Jewish thing, right? I mean, if what we are as a people are people who are devoted to human rights and social justice, the blacklist, it affected Jews, but it also affected us in the sense that we, Jews were the people who fought against it. So Kirk Douglas is famous for breaking it, right? A Jewish actor, for using Dalton Trumbo and using his name, right? Otto Preminger using Dalton Trumbo's name, right? So so this movie has a conscience as well, right? So
Nancy, did you have a question?
Actually, just a comment. The ending of the movie where he says, F you guys, and then walks off and has that element of like wish fulfillment. You're talking about Purim, made me think of exactly that, which is that the Jewish guy gets to say, and he's willing to take the consequences, and obviously they're not going to be horrible, but still, that he finally says it's his fantasy that this is what we do in the world when they're evil people.
Right. And it's a little bit of a based, I think, on Zero Mostel's attempt to get around the committee, right? Is I'll deflect them with not answering, right? But in the end, it's really actually the bookmaking that does him in, So, but and he does go to jail, right? But apparently he gets the girl, right? Because she's there to see him off. I mean, so by the way, this movie was rated R. It was because of that one line, right? That, there was a time when, if you use the F word one time in a movie, you got an R. And so this movie was not PG-13 when it came out, it was R, specifically because of that language. Otherwise this movie is rather, family appropriate, I guess you could say.
Tame. Nancy Frank, did you have a question?
I just had to comment that a movie like this almost has to be shown again to let us know things like this could happen again, and that we should remember.
Yeah. And I think that certainly, the folks who made this movie back in 1976, and think about America in 1976 too. I mean, this movie probably got its start right around the time Nixon resigned, right? So there was that sense of things can go bad in a hurry.
Well, look at now.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is an interesting movie to think about in terms of some of the other stuff that people are talking about who gets banned from Twitter. I mean, whose name are we not allowed to say anymore? What comedian gets canceled, right? I think that's a bigger discussion than we actually can go into today, but it's a very interesting question, right? Because the blacklist back in those days, as the writer tells him right up front, he says, they don't tell you to your face that you're blacklisted, right? They say, this script's not good enough, right? This is not what we were looking for, and that kind of stuff happens a lot. Yeah, Alice.
Yeah, this is adding on to what Nancy just said. I couldn't help but thinking when I was watching, especially those opening credits of showing McCarthy, knowing that his attorney was Roy Cohn and that our past president Trump, was, used Roy Cohn as his attorney. And, and I couldn't help thinking about that when I was watching the movie.
Yeah, Roy Cohn, I have to say, it fascinates me. I mean, it's a really interesting, Shakespearean kind of character, really. And so there was a movie of his life that's worth seeing. The book that it's based on, Citizen Cohn, is really worth reading. And of course, he's a major character in the play Angels in America as well. I mean, it's pretty fascinating. And I believe the production of Angels in America is available. I'm not sure how you get it on Nathan Lane playing Roy Cohn in Angels in America is online these days if you want to see it. So other thoughts about the movie? Did you like it? See a couple of nodding heads.
I mean, I think what Nancy said is that, we need to see it. My one comment on Woody Allen is that this was his first serious movie, but he always plays the same part, and it's not like he breaks out of the New York nebby Jewish, right, whatever. So,
and usually if he's not in the movie, he's hired somebody to play him in the movie,
Yes.
So you have people even like Kenneth Branagh appears in a Woody Allen movie sounding like Woody Allen, which is pretty bizarre, but yeah.
I think Elaine is right that Angels in America is on HBO.
So that there is a version of Angels in America on HBO for sure, but this particular one, which was in England, performed in England with Nathan Lane, I don't think is the HBO one. So I just was seeing in the New York Times that it's becoming available for screening this week, I think. So.
Oh yeah, you're right. Let's
Yeah.
see if I can find this.
So, yeah, so it's, you know, I think it's a slice of time, but it certainly remains applicable. And I think it's worth seeing, as Nancy was saying, you know, every now and then, every generation at least, right? You know, to remind ourselves how easily we can slip into some of these things, into some of the issues of censorship and free expression, right? So it's important. It's got to be important as we, you know, we're going to be prosecuting people, deservedly so, for their role in what happened at the Capitol. Sometimes those things, like after 9/11, they spill over into other areas where you don't necessarily want them to go. So we'll have to keep an eye on that as time goes on. Anyway, so next week is the last one of this particular go round. We're going to have another. So I sent Vanessa 8 movies yesterday and told her I have 24 more. So, you know, so we'll see what happens.
Here's
So,
a little,
so
here's
those
a
are the next
little
dates.
taste of what's coming up, but we're gonna meet next week, and that's February.
I think that's March, right?
It's March 1st.
Today.
Yeah,
For Body and Soul.
Yeah. and then we're off until the 16th.
Right, we're going to take a week off. Yeah. So give me a chance to get ahead a little bit on some of this stuff. So, but thank you very much for being here. And I think you'll see when we look at Body and Soul, we'll see some of the reasons why I paired that one with this one. So,
Right. And again, Body and Soul, you can find at YouTube. I put a link in and I'll put it in again. And you can rent movies there. So.
Great. I saw it for free on YouTube. So just try and get the one that somebody just like filmed it off a television, and that's not a good one. You
No.
want another one.
No.
Or is that a legal one, Taka?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Take care, everybody. We'll
Thank
see you
you.
next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Rita.
Thanks.
See you
Thank you.
tomorrow.
You.